Life in a small town has a rhythm. You wake up, you go to work, you come home, you know your neighbors, you wave to passing cars, and you feel safe leaving your doors unlocked at night. But on the morning of April 22nd, 2016, Pike County, Ohio woke up to something that no small town is ever prepared for.
There's blood all over the house. Okay. My brother-in-law's in the bedroom and I beat the hell out of him.
Inside 4 separate homes, spread across a seemingly peaceful countryside, 8 members of the Rhoden family were found murdered in their sleep. Parents, siblings, a cousin, and a young couple, shot multiple times, their bodies left in a brutal and bloody scene. Yet 3 children who were found inside 2 of these homes, the killers left completely unharmed. Rumors quickly began to circulate throughout the small town, some speculating that this wasn't a random act. Others had people asking, was this a cartel hit, a drug-fueled act of revenge, or was the truth much closer to home? Then, finally, an arrest, one that sent shockwaves through the community. So what could drive someone to commit such horrific acts of violence? To annihilate an entire family in one night? And why did 8 people have to die? Hey guys, I'm Elise, and this is 10 to Life. By 2016, the Rhoden family had been residents of Pike County, Ohio for a very long time. And Pike County is an extremely small place. It's the sort of place where everybody knew one another. A place where you offer people a helping hand wherever you can, and you look out for your neighbors, and you even would know the person working at the local gas station by first and last name. It's a place where, yeah, some minor crimes happen here and there, but for the most part, everybody feels safe and at home. And that was no different for the Rhoden family. This family was pretty big, and it was only getting bigger too. The heads of the family were 37-year-old Dana and 40-year-old Chris. They met when Chris was just 19 and Dana was 16, and not long after meeting, they were married. Pretty much as in before Dana even had her 17th birthday, so they were pretty young to say the least. Dana ended up becoming a nurse because she had always been passionate about helping people. The people who knew her thought that she also had a motherly vibe, which really made her good at working at a hospital. It also meant that she was a good mom once she had children of her own. Now, Chris, on the other hand, Chris was a laborer, and he was no stranger to getting his hands dirty and spending very long days in the sun, all so that he could provide for his family. During their marriage, they had 3 kids together: Clarence, who went by Frankie, Hannah, and Christopher Jr. But by 2007, Dana and Chris had grown apart. And remember, they had met each other and gotten married so young. And like a lot of people who are in similar situations, they eventually just learned that they were different people from when they had first met. So they got divorced. But here's the thing, even after the divorce, they stayed close over the years. Now, of course, I don't know the exact ins and outs of their relationship, but it does sound like it was one of those on-again, off-again situations. So they might have been together romantically at some times, even after they called it quits with their marriage. It's a little unclear. But in 2015, Dana even changed her relationship status on Facebook to "It's complicated," which I think we can agree definitely sends a message. Now, whether they were actually ever fully back together or not, we're not sure. They still lived separate lives, coming together to co-parent their kids, but it was very murky to say the least. Now, Frankie was Dana and Chris's oldest child. He had been born in 1995, just a year after their wedding. And like his parents, he also became a pretty young parent, which isn't that unusual in the area where they lived. When Frankie was just a teen himself, he and a woman named Chelsea had a son together, who they named Brentley. Frankie and Chelsea's relationship, unfortunately, didn't, stand the test of time, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because it meant that Frankie was free to eventually meet his fiancée, Hannah. Now, obviously, I don't want to confuse her with his sister, Hannah, so I'm going to refer to the fiancée by her last name as Gilly. And Frankie really loved Gilly. She motivated him to be the best dad that he could be to Brentley and to just really work hard. He had 2 jobs, one doing maintenance and the other one was in the lumber industry, just like his dad. And when he and Gilly later found out that she was pregnant, he was ecstatic. So in 2015, they welcomed a son together, his second and Gilly's first. Then there was Frankie's sister, the other Hannah. And she was the second oldest, and her life story is very similar to her parents and to her brother. When she was 13 years old, she began dating a local guy named Jake. He was much older than Hannah. He was 18 years old at the time. But from her perspective, it felt like a pretty typical whirlwind romance. She seemed really happy with him and really in love with him. And it probably helped that Jake was also an old friend of the family. The Rhodens and the Wagners went back a very long time, so no one in either family thought that it was weird for the two of them to be together, even with that age gap. Nobody was mad, nobody was objecting the relationship, it just kind of felt natural. Eventually, when Hannah was just 15 though, she found out that she was pregnant. And Jake, the father, was 20 years old at the time. So the two of them had a daughter who they named Sophie, and even though they were both still young, they really did step up to the plate and seemingly change overnight from these young and irresponsible teenagers to young adults and parents. Jake worked on his family farm, and Hannah eventually began working as a CNA with big dreams of becoming a nurse one day just like her mom. However, a few years into their relationship, things began to fizzle out a little bit, at least on Hannah's end. She no longer felt the way that she had about Jake when she first met him, and she ended up breaking things off with him. Now, this breakup was something that never sat right with Jake. He would constantly beg for her to come back. He tried arguing that it was really the best thing to do for Sophie to have the whole family together. And at times, Hannah would sometimes have second thoughts about leaving Jake, and she'd hear him out, kind of give him a chance to explain, see if maybe they could work things out together. But I also want to be very clear, they never fully reconciled and they never fully got back together. It was sort of like the situation with her parents. There was like some on again, off again, maybe a little back and forth type of energy. They were also, of course, in contact a lot because they had to co-parent little Sophie. But then sometime in 2015, Hannah found out that she was pregnant again. And there was a lot of uncertainty around who the real father was, if it was Jake or if it was somebody else. Some time went by, and eventually it came out that Jake was not the father. So basically, Hannah's life was a bit complicated, but she was working on getting a fresh start. Now, Hannah's youngest brother was Christopher Jr., and he was the baby of his family. In 2016, he was only 16 years old. He was still in high school and still kind of working out what he wanted to do with his life after graduation. Unlike his siblings, he didn't have any kids, and he was basically just living the life of an average, carefree teenager. During the summers, he would work at Big Bear Lake Resort, which wasn't too far from Pike County, and he was a hard worker, just like the rest of his family. And that also applied to Dana's sister, Bobby Jo. Now, for Bobby Jo, April 22nd, 2016, really started like any other morning. She made her way over to Chris's property, ready to feed some of the pets and the livestock, just like she always did. But as she stepped onto the property that morning, she had absolutely no idea that she was about to walk into a nightmare. One that would change her life in the worst way imaginable. It was right before 8 a.m., and usually Chris would come out and would greet her, they would chat for a while, that sort of thing. But that day, the place was eerily quiet. So Bobby Jo went inside, calling Chris's name to let him know, that she was there, that she had arrived. But again, she was met with silence, which was strange. Chris was always awake. He was always out of bed by 8 a.m., unless maybe he was deathly sick, but even that was a stretch. So she began walking through the trailer, just continuing to call out his name, going from room to room. And that is when she saw it.
There's blood all over the house. Okay. My brother lost in the bedroom and I beat the hell out of him.
At first, Bobby Jo thought she stumbled upon Chris unconscious and bloody, like someone had beaten him within an inch of his life. And like you heard, there was blood everywhere. And she eventually found someone else in the house. Someone who was also apparently hurt, Chris's cousin, Gary Rhoden. Gary was pretty close with Chris, only a few years younger than him. But the weirdest thing about this was that Gary had also seemingly been beaten. He also looked like he was unconscious, unmoving, and there was blood everywhere. So I think it's safe to assume that Bobby Jo was in a state of shock. I mean, to say the least, right? I don't think she could even begin to process what she was actually seeing in this moment or what she had found. Because what Bobby Jo didn't even realize at the time that she called 911 was that Chris and Gary weren't lying there unconscious because they had been beaten so badly. They were both actually dead. Chris and Gary had been dead for quite a few hours too, and they had each been shot in the head multiple times. But Bobby Jo still thought that they could be saved. So because of this, she ran next door to Chris's trailer, where Frankie, his fiancée Gilly, and their 2 children were all living. But once again, everything was very eerily quiet. Bobby Jo expected to walk into the trailer and to find Gilly making a bottle while Frankie was, putting on his boots, getting ready for work for the day. But instead, she pushed her way into their main master bedroom and walked right back into a living nightmare, this time for the second time that day. Both Frankie and Gilly were unconscious, not moving, and very bloody. just like Chris and Gary, they were dead. They both had multiple gunshot wounds to the head, just like Chris and Gary. Now, it's not entirely clear to me if Bobby Jo had realized in that moment that Frankie and Gilly had been shot, or if she was still in shock. However, what she did realize next, some might consider nothing short of a miracle. Because somehow both of the babies inside this home were okay. They weren't physically harmed in any way. And most importantly, they were alive. This was in spite of the fact that the 6-month-old was lying right next to Gilly, just covered in blood. Later on, the investigators guessed that Gilly was probably breastfeeding when she was shot, which was why the baby was covered in her blood and quite literally lying at her side where she had eventually dropped him. I mean, talk about a nightmare. Eventually, Bobby Jo walked outside and waited for the police to come. And like I said, I don't know exactly what was going through her mind. I can imagine that none of it felt very real at all in that moment. But still, she mustered up the strength to call her and Dana's brother, and she begged him to go tell Dana the news. She knew that her sister needed to hear about what had happened from somebody who was close to them, not just the police. So their brother James went over to Dana's trailer, prepared to tell her what they knew so far, to be there for her when she needed it, to console her, to, just be a loving person next to her. But as soon as he walked inside, he was met with that same eerie silence. Nobody was in the living room watching TV. Nobody was in the kitchen getting ready for the day. The shower wasn't running. It was like nobody was even there. And unfortunately, that meant that nightmare was not over yet. James found that Dana, Hannah, and Christopher Jr. had all been shot multiple times. They had all been dead for hours, just like everyone that Bobby Jo had found earlier. But once again, whoever had done this had spared the children who were there. Hannah's baby was alive and was okay. But just like in Frankie and his fiance's house, the baby was lying next to her body in bed like nothing ever happened. Her oldest, Sophie, had been at Jake's house the night prior, so she luckily had never been in any danger. But still, that made for 7 family members in 3 different homes, all murdered in cold blood. And as crazy as it seems, that wasn't even the end of the Rhoden family nightmare. Remember, Bobby Jo found the first round of bodies at around 8 a.m. Now, obviously, the investigators came and they were doing their job, but just a few hours later, yet another 911 call came in. I mean, this was just a very rough and horrifying day for the Pike County Police Department, because now this call was at 1:26 p.m. And on the other end of the line was a man who identified himself as Donald Stone, which doesn't sound familiar, right? Well, even though his last name wasn't Rhoden, he was related. His cousin was a guy named Kenneth Rhoden, Chris's brother. And unfortunately, Donald was going through something very similar to the rest of the Rhoden family. On his call, he was frantic when he said that he had gotten over to Kenneth's house after Kenneth had been ignoring all of his calls, and when he showed up, he found Kenneth dead with a single gunshot wound to the head. So Kenneth was the 8th and final Rhoden family member to be found murdered in his home.
I hollered at Kenneth. I said, "Kenneth, can you hear me?" No response. I turned around and looked at Luke. I said, "Luke," I said, "you don't need to see this." I walk up to the foot of the bed, and I raised my head up and looked and seen blood in his eyes. And I knew then he was dead. A little different than Miney. I seen Miney laying on the bed. I found that odd.
Now just take a second to really absorb that. 8 people, ranging from just 16 years old to 44 years old, brutally murdered in a single night. A case like that would be terrifying anywhere, but in a small town where everyone feels like they know each other, where the idea of being that close to a killer seems impossible, it shakes everything that you believe in about safety, about trust. And in that moment, the people of Pike County had to face a chilling reality. The killers weren't just out there. They were still walking free. And worse, they were likely among them. Right away, the Pike County Police Department felt that this had to have been personal. I mean, the killer had gone to multiple houses, which some of them were miles away from one another. So that didn't sound like a break-in gone wrong or a spontaneous crime spree. It was clear that the murderer had intentionally targeted all of the adults and the teenagers in the Rhoden family. It really doesn't take an expert to put those two things together. But there were also some weird details that stood out to the police. For example, Chris had multiple pit bull dogs on the property, and they were left alive and completely unharmed, which was especially odd because these dogs were guard dogs. I mean, guard dogs through and through. They were sweet as can be to Chris and his family and his buddies, but they could be very vicious and very aggressive with strangers. So if someone they didn't know even stepped foot on the property, they would have started barking and just going berserk, going nuts, alerting Chris. And the people who knew the family and the dogs were also confident that the pit bulls would have absolutely attacked anyone who they didn't know. So the fact that the killer left the dogs alive, it suggested that the pit bulls weren't attacking them or barking at them. In other words, the murder was probably committed by somebody who knew the family pretty well. Then there was the fact that Daniel Stone had found money lying next to Kenneth's body, just like he had said in that interview. Again, another sign that this wasn't a robbery because the killer didn't take the cash. So again, it sounded like the killings were more personally motivated. And the police also had another theory that they were toying with too, that maybe there were actually multiple murderers. The first clue to hint at this was the fact that Chris's trailer was on the same property as Frankie and Gilly's, meaning if someone broke into one of those trailers and started shooting people, whoever was in the other trailer would have heard it. And these were people who had been born and raised in the country, on farms, shooting deer, fishing, doing all of these outdoorsy things. They would have known exactly what they were hearing if they overheard gunshots. But there was no sign that anybody had gotten out of bed to go investigate, or that anybody had called 911 before they got killed. And it seemed like that would only be possible if multiple killers were coordinating the murders, so that they would basically be happening simultaneously. All to say, the police already had some theories early on about how these murders played out, but they weren't making any public announcements at the beginning. They were keeping all of the information fairly close to their chests. For 2 whole days, there was pretty much complete silence. All the police department really said was that an investigation had begun and that they were guarding and blocking off everybody's property so that nobody would disturb the crime scenes. But there weren't any actual updates of substance, especially any update that made the public feel any better about the situation. That is until April 24th, when the silence finally broke. The Ohio Attorney General came forward with a major announcement. Investigators had searched the land and the homes that the Rhoden family owned, and 3 out of the 4 of those properties were, as what he called them, marijuana grow operations. Now, I get that some of you might be thinking, okay, big deal, it was just some weed, who cares, right? But keep in mind 2 really big things. First of all, there were hundreds of plants. It's not like someone was growing something for their personal stash or something like that. This was evidence that the Rhodens were doing a much more professional drug business. And second, it's worth remembering that this was back in 2016. Weed hadn't been decriminalized yet in Ohio, so growing marijuana was a lot more illegal then than it is now. So naturally, the rumors spread like wildfire that maybe the murders were connected to drugs. Maybe the Rhodens had been killed by rival drug dealers, or they were involved with the cartel, something because of their illegal business. And it might sound a bit outlandish, but things like this had happened before in Pike County. In 2010 and 2012, police found illegal grow operations, and they were able to link them to a Mexican cartel. So it wasn't super out there to assume that just 4 years later, maybe the Rhodens had gotten involved in something dangerous and it had ultimately gotten them killed. Now, I will say that all of the surviving Rhodens denied having anything to do with any sort of professional drug dealing operation. They said that the weed that the police had found was just all for personal use, which I gotta say, it's kind of hard to believe given how much of it there was, but that's what they said. Dana's dad stood up for his daughter and argued that she had absolutely nothing to do with the pot, though, whatsoever. He also said that he was pretty angry at the people who were dragging his daughter's name through the mud. And honestly, I really can't blame her dad for speaking up, even if the rumors were true. And the fact of the matter is, we don't know if they even were true. They could have just been gossip. But then, 2 days later, on April 26th, the investigators came forward with another update. And this one was pretty hard to hear, because it involved the preliminary autopsy reports, and they really drove home just how brutal these murders had been. Every single member, excluding Kenneth, had been shot multiple times. Chris, the head of the household, was shot 9 times. 9. I mean, complete and utter overkill. His wounds were quite literally all over his body. There was no rhyme or reason to where he got hit either, which is why the investigators also concluded that Chris must have been awake at the time of the murder. It seemed like maybe he had heard something, he had walked to the bedroom door, and then somebody just shot him through the door, just showering him with bullets all over the place. Interestingly enough, though, the report also showed that Chris's body showed signs of decomposition. And there were no other notes or anything that really explained what that meant, which obviously we know what decomposition means, but given that he had only been dead for a few hours when he was found, I can't imagine that he was decomposed. So I'm guessing he was probably the first to die, and that the report was just saying that his body had been dead for longer than any of the others that were found, but I'm not entirely sure. I am not a scientist. But next was Chris's cousin Gary, who lived with Chris. Gary was shot 3 times in the head. Frankie was also shot 3 times in the head, and Gilly, on the other hand, was shot 5 times in the face and the head. Christopher Jr. was shot 4 times, including twice on the top of his head, and Hannah was shot twice. And then lastly, we have Kenneth, who, like I mentioned, only had 1 gunshot wound. And the report said that that gunshot wound went through his right eye. So that was pretty much the last major update in the case for quite some time. The funerals were held, everyone's family and friends said their goodbyes, prayed that the case would be solved. But time passed, a week passed, then a month passed, then 2 and 3. And the police spoke to every survivor in the extended Rhoden family, saying, we're warning you, we still don't know who the killer was. We don't know if this killer will strike again. Saying everyone needed to be especially vigilant and especially careful. But I also don't want to make it sound like the police weren't working hard, because they were behind the scenes. They brought in a bunch of different agencies, and they literally had over 250 people working together trying to solve this. The Ohio Bureau of Investigation brought in 100 investigators on top of 25 sheriffs from all across Ohio. They even had the FBI and the DEA working the case. But from the end of April to August, there weren't any public updates. However, there were plenty of things going on behind the scenes. For example, on May 3rd, they towed 3 different vehicles to search them. I'm not sure if they were cars, trucks, vans, or something else, but at least they were looking into it and trying to figure it out. And then the following day, another vehicle was taken in for the same reasons. In the meantime, people called in with a total of over 500 different tips. Plus, the police interrogated, I think it was no fewer than 130 people. So they were definitely trying to work this case. Then on May 12th, the investigators announced that they were going to take the mobile homes where the victims had been living. They wanted to move them somewhere else for the investigation, and they didn't say where they were going to take them, but it was somewhere that would be easier for the investigators to access, and someplace secure so that nobody could come in, nobody could destroy evidence, nothing like that. Then fast forward a little more time to August 4th, and there was a court hearing to work out custody for the surviving children, and that included Hannah's daughter Sophie. She had been with her father Jake this entire time. However, during that hearing, some important new information came out. That's when some police officers came to court to say they were worried that the children were still in danger. I mean, sure, yes, the killers had let the kids live that first time around, but nobody knew if the murderers would come back to finish the job. And keep in mind, this was the first time that anyone publicly stated that the surviving Rhoden family members could be in danger. The specific family members that were impacted knew, but it wasn't public knowledge until this day. Then, on August 13th, there was a little bit of chaos because a reporter announced on TV that the police had arrested 2 suspects in the murders. Which would be great, right? Great news. This case has been solved, or at least it was close to being solved. Apparently, these 2 guys had killed a police officer in Hatch, New Mexico, and now that they had been caught for that crime, the investigators were also looking into them for this horrific family massacre. But as it turns out, that report was a huge mistake. Yes, 2 men had been arrested for shooting an officer, and yes, they were suspects in another shooting death in Ohio, but that other death took place in a different county, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the Rhoden family. So that kind of gives you a sense of how this investigation was going. It was slowly, with a lot of false starts, a lot of starts and stops, and not really anything concrete to go off of. And before everyone knew it, it was April 22nd, 2017. A full year had passed since these murders, and no arrests had been made. Then, on May 12th, there was a pretty significant update. Dozens of investigators began searching a 71-acre farm in Peebles. And this was not too far from Pike County. Now, this farm had once belonged to Hannah's ex-boyfriend Jake, and apparently the farm had been sold back in March, so a few months prior. And given how quickly gossip spread in Pike County, I mean, right away, everybody was wondering if Jake might have had something to do with these mass murders. But the police didn't make any announcements afterward about what that search had all been about. They didn't say what they had been looking for, and they definitely didn't say what they had found, if they did find anything. So even though this search had been big news, a few months went by and everyone kind of just forgot about it. That is until June, when the investigators actually came forward announcing that they were seeking more information on Jake. And not just Jake, but also his parents, Billy and Angela, and his brother George too. And you always hear about cases where someone makes a comment in passing like, oh, well, I'm glad my ex-wife died, and it kind of makes them look a little suspicious, right? Well, that was pretty much the kind of thing that they were looking for here. And they were looking for tips. Like, did you guys ever hear them say anything funny? Did you ever hear any sort of innuendo or anything like that? And interestingly enough, they even announced that they were also looking for tips about if Jake or his family members had ever talked about specific vehicles or guns or ammunition. But nobody had a whole lot to share, because the whole family had apparently up and moved to Alaska during the entire last year of the investigation. And nobody had really even blinked an eye at it when it was happening, especially since the police had also been saying that Jake's little daughter, Sophie, might be in trouble and might be in danger. It made sense that he would want to take her away from all of that violence. And in fact, at one point, Jake even publicly said, really? The point to moving up here was to basically get into a better environment so that they wouldn't talk about us. My daughter's getting older, so she wouldn't hear it, and then it just followed us here. So to summarize, the police were asking for tips about Jake and his family, but nobody had anything. And with no information coming in, there was no more forward progress. So more months went by. And then the next thing everybody knew, it was 2018, the 2-year anniversary of the murders. And I've got to imagine that by this time, the surviving Rhodens were feeling doubtful about whether or not they would ever get justice. But then, on November 13th, 2018, an update came out. And it was a shocker, because Jake had been arrested in connection with the murders. And it wasn't just Jake who was arrested. So had his parents, Billy and Angela, his brother George, Angela's mom, Rita, and Billy's mom, Frederica. So that is pretty much the entire Wagner family. Jake, his parents, his brother, his 2 grandmas. And there were tons of charges against all of them. Jake's charges, in particular, read like a grocery list. I mean, it included aggravated murder, felony conspiracy, aggravated burglary, tampering with evidence, forgery, you name it. But Billy, Angela, and George, they were also charged with carefully planning these murders, executing them with Jake, hiding the evidence, and misleading the police. As for Billy and Angela's mothers, they weren't physically involved in planning or carrying out the murders, but the investigators found enough evidence to indicate that they had both lied to the police, and they had committed perjury and obstruction of justice. So needless to say, this was definitely like a full-on extended family affair. And you might be wondering, okay, well, what led the Wagner family to completely annihilate the Rhoden family? These were 2 families who had known each other so well, who used to get along, who grew up together. Well, it all boiled down to custody and Hannah's unwillingness to be with Jake. After their breakup, Jake and his family began pressuring Hannah to just hand Sophie over, that they just wanted their daughter or their granddaughter, their, family member. They wanted her all to themselves. They didn't want to share. And when she became pregnant with her second child, even after she realized the baby wasn't his, he told her he wanted to put his name on the birth certificate just to keep this whole happy family thing together, the one he was trying so hard to keep. Surely, if she had 2 of his kids, she'd have to be with him, right? That's how he was thinking. Obviously, that's not how things were, and it's not how they worked out. So because of that, that's when things went from lovey-dovey to pretty toxic. Jake was really not okay with Hannah having another guy's baby. And even though the Rhoden and Wagner families had been close before, now the whole families were beginning to not get along with each other. Hannah basically felt like Jake's family was trying to control her. And apparently they had accused her of not protecting her and Jake's daughter Sophie from possibly being sexually assaulted. They weren't sure who was doing it or that she was even truly being abused. There were just things here and there that made them question it. I don't know what that is, but as you can tell, it was all pretty ugly. There were countless arguments back and forth about custody and about Sophie's well-being. And at one point, things got so dicey that Hannah even sent a Facebook message to Jake. She said that the only way that he and his family would get full custody of Sophie was if they killed her first. Now, of course, when Hannah typed that message, she had no idea that she might have just planted a seed in his little devious mind. The prosecutors believed that Jake had always had a dark side. I mean, let's not forget, he got Hannah pregnant when she was only 15 years old and he was 20 years old. Even if their whole family treated that situation like it was normal and fine and no big deal, it definitely was not okay. And then when Hannah refused to be one big happy family with him, he became enraged. The police believe that he did everything he could to control her, and when she tried to break things off, he escalated and began stalking her and threatening her. Now, as for Jake's family, the prosecutors claimed that they were all Team Jake, all to this, unhealthy, toxic degree. Just Jake, 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 no matter what. If Jake was ever upset, they always took his side, even if he was in the wrong. Anything that Hannah did and he didn't like, they took it as some kind of personal attack. Then they would all get worked up off one another and egg each other on, get upset, even over things that had nothing to do with them. And they just kind of all came together in that hatred. So then they all began carefully planning the murders. And apparently their assumption was that if they had just killed Hannah, there would be this line of her family members at the police station pointing the finger right back at them. So the only way to avoid getting caught was to kill every single person who knew Hannah well enough to know about her and Jake's issues. Again, that's what the prosecutors believed. But they couldn't be sure yet because all of the Wagners had pleaded not guilty after their arrests. They denied everything that the detectives were saying, arguing none of it was even close to being the truth. And they stuck to that story. That is until the stakes got a little bit higher, until the death penalty was on the table. And that's when they all started slowly changing their tune. The state offered Jake a plea deal. And then they went to him first because he was the ringleader of this whole murder plot. The offer was for him to plead guilty in exchange for the state promising not to pursue the death penalty for him or any of the Wagners. Not for him, his mom, his dad, his brother, his grandmas, nobody. And part of the deal was also that Jake also had to testify against his family members. And when there's a chance that you and your entire family could die at the hands of the state, I guess you have to take whatever options you can because he agreed. He flipped. So on March 21st, 2021, exactly 5 years after the murders, Jake accepted that deal and he pleaded guilty to all of the charges. That also included one charge of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, and that was for getting Hannah pregnant when she was just 15. Now, even though it didn't have anything to do with the murders, it was still pretty satisfying that everyone in the Rhoden family got to stand and get justice and that there was justice for all the actions, for everything. So Jake admitted that he snapped after Hannah had sent him that Facebook message saying she would never give up custody if she was still alive, that over my dead body, you gotta kill me first. And he realized she was telling the truth and that he would never get what he wanted unless she was dead. So from then on, the entire Wagner family spent 3 full months planning these murders. They knew that they would have to be careful to not leave any evidence behind, so they just carefully started planning. They already had guns, but they bought some more ammunition. They bought some special equipment too so that they could make these untraceable silencers. And they even went as far as buying something called brass catchers, which is a thing that apparently catches every single shell casing once a gun goes off so that nothing is left behind. They also bought a specific truck and new shoes so that nobody would recognize the car that they took to the scene or any of their footprints. I mean, carefully planned. On top of that, they wore masks, and Jake and George both dyed their hair on the week of the murders, just as an extra precaution so that if anybody happened to see them, they wouldn't be recognized at all, completely unrecognizable. Now, Jake claimed that the only people who were actually supposed to die were Chris, Dana, Hannah, and Hannah's brothers, Frankie and Christopher, as if that makes anything any better, right? He said everybody else, though, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Frankie's fiance Gilly was home, so the Wagners killed her to avoid having a living witness. Same thing for Chris's cousin Gary, who lived with him. Now, as for Kenneth, who lived on a different property all by himself, I'm actually not sure why he ended up being killed. Maybe it was like I mentioned earlier that Jake and his family knew that Kenneth would have had a good idea of who could have done this crime, making him a liability. I'm not really sure. But whatever the reason, Jake ended up confessing to killing 6 of the 8 family members. Billy killed the other 2. And while the boys were out, doing their dirty work, doing these murders, Angela sat at home watching her granddaughter, looking at her beautiful little innocent face, knowing that the rest of her family was on their way to being brutally murdered. and that her mother was being brutally murdered by her own family. Angela had helped with the planning, and that night she also held on to everybody's phones so that if anybody ever went back and checked the phone records, it would look like everybody was home together that night. And Jake admitted to all of that. He also helped the police track down the murder weapons, which they hadn't been able to locate before now. He told the police that the guns were inside a piece of concrete, and get this, he also told them that his family had actually given the concrete as a Father's Day gift to a family member who needed an anchor on their boat. Now, this family member had absolutely no idea that they were literally hauling around actual evidence from a family massacre and unsolved murder every time they took this boat out and used this as an anchor. Which, can you imagine? I mean, can you imagine learning that after the fact? So with this information, the police got a search warrant and they found the anchor, the piece of concrete that had the guns still inside of it. And there's one other thing that I need to talk about regarding Jake's decision to testify against his family. Because at first glance, it sounds like maybe he wanted to help them so that they didn't get the death penalty. He finally felt like, I'm scared. I just don't want my family to die. All of these things. But apparently, once he took the deal and had a chance to throw them under the bus, that's exactly what he did. Jake went on this whole spiel about how his parents had raised him to be this dishonest, cold-blooded criminal, calculated. And he claimed that from a very young age, his dad even taught him how to pick locks, how to break into vending machines, how to even steal cattle from other people's farms without getting caught. And as if that wasn't already crazy enough, he also said that his family had once built a house purely out of stolen materials. Different things that they had, gone out and stolen here and there and then built it. He also said that Angela spent some time breeding dogs and then lying to claim that they were purebred when she would sell them, which I don't know if that helps explain the way Jake ended up the way that he was, or if he was just trying to use excuses, but I don't think there's any question that his whole family was just like a pile of dirtbags, right? So just a few months after pleading guilty, in September of 2021, Jake was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences with the possibility of parole after 32 years, which 32 years feels very quick to me when we're talking about 8 people dead. That same month, Angela also pleaded guilty, and she was sentenced to 30 years with 6 years already served. Her mother, Rita, was sentenced to 5 years probation and a $700 and change fine, and then 180 days in jail. But Billy's mother's charges, those ended up being dismissed for whatever reason. Then, of course, came Jake's brother, George, and like Jake, he was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms, but without the possibility of parole. And the reasoning for this was pretty much that the courts wanted to make an example out of him. Jake had cooperated with the police. He had pleaded guilty. But George had wasted everybody's time and chose to go to trial. Now, interestingly enough, this case is still ongoing because Jake's dad, Billy, also decided to take his case to trial, which I can't imagine why, especially after seeing George's sentence, but it's my opinion that it's clearly not going to go well for him, which boo-hoo. But either way, his trial was supposed to begin in January of 2025, but now it is pushed back to May, which I have no doubts that in a few months, when that trial does happen, he will for sure be found guilty. But let's talk about the people who are most impacted by these murders, the people who loved the members of the Rhoden family and who are still grieving to this day. During one of the sentencing hearings, Frankie's fiance's mother gave an impact statement. And honestly, guys, it's probably one of the most heartbreaking and gut-wrenching impact statements that I have heard in a while. Her pain is just so apparent and her words cut so deep.
You 3 helped plan, carry out, and murder my grandson, Ruger, who was 6 months old, laying in the bed between his mom and dad, Frankie, Rhoden, and Hazel Gillian, let alone your granddaughter's mother. How greedy of a grandmother are you? How greedy. Your granddaughter's mother. You're evil. You're evil. You are the spawn of Satan's. And the Satan is Billy Wagner. You are the evilest mother to help plan, carry out, and take the lives of 3 other mothers. My daughter was only 20, and you want 30 years of your life behind bars. 30? She was 20! 20! She never even got to buy alcohol. She got 6 months of her life with her kid. 6 months. And Hannah Mae Rhoden, the love of your life, Jake Wagner. The love of your life. Your daughter's mother, greedy Jake Wagner. You. I want you to suffer. This is what I want. And I've told all of BCI. I want your mother to live and you boys to die as well as your dad. I want you to die so your mom feels the heartache of what it's like to bury a child. It's a heartache that never goes away. I hate you. You ruined my life. You ruined innocent children's lives. I hope you die. I pray every day you die. I pray your grandchildren and your children never want anything to do with you. And I hope they never do. I hope your daughter hates you with a passion and as much heart as I hate you, Jake Wagner. You shook my hand and acted as if you was my fucking friend. After you shot my daughter 5 times in the head. 5 times? Man, Wagner, son laid between them. And Hannah Mae, she's holding her little girl. And you shot her. How cold and evil. You are the spawn of Satan. I'll say it again. Spawns of Satan. You and your brother. And you, evilness, created them. And Miss Rita, I feel so sorry for you because I know you're ashamed to have such a daughter and grandsons that evil. Because you was the first to feel the guilt and say you were sorry, and it was your Christian duty to tell the truth. So I have not very many words for you. My heart breaks for you to have such an evil, control, and spawns of Satan.
I mean, very heavy, I know. But then this statement from Chris and Kenneth's brother had a completely different vibe. Take a listen.
I would like to start by saying I would like to thank the citizens of Pike County. I would like to thank the citizens of the state of Ohio for bearing this burden that should have never happened to this family in Southern Ohio.
Just commenting, Tony, about how the relationship seemed to be one of affection between the Wagners and at least your brother Chris and so forth. What do you make of all this madness?
You said the word.
Madness. What did you feel when you heard the first guilty verdict? What was going through your mind, and anyone else who'd care to comment?
I feel sorry for him.
Why is that? Why?
Because he is human.
How do you find the humanity at a time like this when he did so much to your family?
I think we all have human in us. There's just a difference in us.
Tony, what did your mom say?
That's between us.
Okay.
Tony, this has been such a long, awful road for you all. I'm sure you're feeling a lot of emotions, but can you give us any sense of what you're feeling just right now?
A little bit of peace. We still have a long road to go. We'll get there.
Then Angela actually spoke up at her hearing, feeling sorry for herself, feeling sorry for the direction her life had taken. But thankfully, the judge did not buy any of it.
Because separated from my family, the ones I love most in the world, brings me unbearable, suffocating pain too. And for this, I am so truly sorry.
I understand you didn't go to the 4 scenes. Nobody seems to talk about the fact that you're the only person that could have stopped the whole thing with one phone call. You're standing there with cell phones that people want you to ping to make it look like you're home. All you had to do was call in. Stop the whole thing. The depravity was that you didn't see the moral need to shut it all down.
Like mother, like son, because Jake also spoke, claiming, you guessed it, he found God. The typical, I'm not that kind of person anymore, which, get a new line, it is so unoriginal.
I've had friendship or relationships with life. Many of you. And I know full well that the weight of my crimes is what I've done to you and your family. There's no amount of apology I can give today, no amount of explanation, no thing I can do to help you reduce the pain you have, loss, anger, hate. Nothing can save that. But I'm not going to tell you, oh, this, and that. I'm going to tell you about me. Because, yeah, I used to be a manipulator. Ms. Gilly affirmed that, and I truly was. But after I committed this crime, I was filled with guilt. Ms. Gilly, I'm going to look at you because I feel you have the most hate. And this is for you. And whenever I committed those crimes, it was probably 2 or 3 weeks later, I was weighted down with the guilt I did. And I said the most sincere prayer to that day I ever said, to that date. And I asked God. I didn't like what I did. Didn't like how I was living. Didn't like how the possibility of my daughter or even my nephew would grow up to be. And I asked God. I said, put me and my family back on the straight and narrow path by any means necessary. Any. And I can tell you today, I am not sorry I got caught. I'm sorry for what I've done. But I am glad I got caught. I 100% believe that it was Jesus who made me get caught, answered my prayer. And I can tell you from my own experience, hate will not heal your heart. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't. But I ask you, if you are a woman of at least some kind of faith, you should really read the Bible, because hate won't do it. Hate won't condemn yourself. We're all weak. We all fall short of the glory of God. I knew that, and I was one of those people who believed, okay, sure, I'm a sinner, I'll sin every day. It's not like, why should I try? I ask for forgiveness when I eat, go to sleep, and I'll be good. I wasn't good. That's not what Jesus preaches. Jesus says specifically, you come to me with all your burdens, all your sorrows, all of your pain, and you surrender, and he will heal you. Nobody can say that they are a God-fearing Christian, born again, and think sin is nothing. At least little sins. Lying. Lying is just as much an abomination as any other thing. I've committed murder. I've committed every single sin that the Bible lists.
Once Jake was finally finished with his speech, the judge laid into him for it. And I think it's good, because it's okay to have faith and be a Christian. Of course, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that you get to act all superior or tell other people how they're allowed to feel, especially when you're the one who literally was on trial for murder.
Mr. Wagner, that allocution, that statement, further demonstrates the role the court does not serve.
I know.
Everything you just said is perfectly appropriate. It's been heard many times before, as has the victim. But to the extent that there's a religious overtone, I don't factor in religious values. It's the same standard. The legal prescriptions, the laws of the government that I impose. I heard remorse. I heard your understanding and your explanation for it. But to the extent that you might, or somebody might have taken that as preaching, that's fine, except it has no meaning to me.
It's extremely hard to think about the poor kids in this case, too. Brentley was just 3 years old when his world was turned upside down. He was there in the house, and to this day, he still struggles with very intense PTSD. His mother, Chelsea, says he often gets vivid nightmares, that he's afraid to walk around the house alone, like he's worried that he's going to walk in somewhere and find something terrible. And if he ever needs to get from one room to another, she says he always needs somebody to go with him. No kid should ever have to live with that kind of fear, ever. Now, the other 2 kids were only 6 months and 4 days old, so we can only hope that they were too young to remember any of the details from that night. But either way, remembering or not, one day, if they haven't already, that is, they will learn the truth about what happened. And when they do, they will have to live with that reality, trying to make sense of a past that they just never had the chance to escape. The killers might be behind bars, but the families that were left behind, no sentence will ever bring back their loved ones. A full family massacre. The only thing left to do now is remember. to keep the victims alive, not just in name, but in memory, in stories, and in their hearts. And it's just so sad. We talk about spouses who turn on each other and commit violence and murders because they want their child, because they can't imagine not having custody of their child or having a nuclear family. But then look at what you do. Your child loses both parents, you as well. You know, you're putting them at the disadvantage. And in this case, you wiped out their entire family. How selfish is that? Because now they don't have their mom's side of the family, their dad's side of the family. Like, it's all fractured and completely disjointed. Because why? Because you're so pissed off that you felt you were entitled to being with her and only having your nuclear family. It's unbelievable. You have to just like look at it too from like the ripple effects and how it causes it, like what it causes. It's horrific. It's so selfish and the ultimate senseless crime, in my opinion. I appreciate you guys tuning in today because, again, it generates a lot of awareness about partner violence, about safety, and just about always kind of double checking who you're getting involved with, because people oftentimes are not who they pretend to be. And in this case, it's just true evil, not just by the father, but his entire family. Just sick, twisted, deranged, unbalanced evil. And that's really all I have to say on it. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning into another case. And until the next one, stay safe. Bye.